myths are still being translated. We have 9 epic tales, so that we can now speak of a Sumerian heroic age.
Sumerian tablets are probably one of the oldest form of written record that we have.
The camera was rolling. A 91-year-old man with trembling hands and wet eyes leaned forward and said 5 words that should have rewritten every history book on the planet. He said, "The tablets don't describe what we think." Samuel Noah Kramer, the single greatest authority on the oldest civilization in human history, had been keeping a secret for decades, and he was weeks away from taking it to the grave. What he revealed on that tape is the reason you've never been taught the real story of where we come from. The man who owned Sumer. For 60 years, one man controlled everything the modern world believed about ancient Sumer, not contributed to, controlled. Samuel Noah Kramer translated more Sumerian tablets than any human being alive. Over 2,500 individual texts across his career. Every textbook, every museum placard, every documentary explaining those strange wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay. All of it traced back to one person, working alone in the basement of the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia. Down a narrow staircase, past storage rooms filled with forgotten artifacts, Kramer had carved out a workspace surrounded by thousands of clay fragments that were older than the Bible, older than the pyramids, older than almost anything human hands had ever created.
Here is a Sumerian tablet that actually shows the tree of life, flanked by divine beings. You can see here the Anunnaki on each side.
These pieces of baked earth carried information written over 4,000 years ago in a language that had been completely dead for millennia. No one alive spoke it. No one remembered it. It existed only in the impressions pressed into clay by people who turned to dust before Rome was even a rumor. And get this? When Kramer started in the 1920s, there were no Sumerian dictionaries, no professors who could teach the language. The cuneiform system contained over 600 individual signs, many with multiple readings depending on context. He had to compare thousands of texts, hunting for recurring patterns like a codebreaker working on an alien transmission. Slowly, obsessively, he cracked it open. By 1956, when he published History Begins at Sumer, he had given humanity the first love songs ever written, the first legal codes, the first recorded schools, and the first father-son arguments committed to writing. Thorkild Jacobson at Yale called Kramer's work the foundation on which the entire field was built. Benno Landsberger at the University of Chicago built his own lexical research on Kramer's framework. The man didn't just study ancient Sumer, he was the lens through which the rest of the world saw it.
Firstly, there's some lines of cuneiform ruled across very firmly at the top, and this is about the early creation of the world.
But here's the catch. While universities were building entire departments on his translations, something was rotting inside that basement. Kramer was growing uneasy. He started burying confessions in the footnotes of his academic papers, quiet admissions that certain Sumerian concepts were impossible to render in English. That particular words had no equivalent. That key passages remained, in his words, stubbornly obscure to anyone. Skimming those papers, it looked like the careful qualifications of a responsible scholar. But Jacobson noticed. In a 1987 letter, he wrote to Kramer asking why so many of his recent papers carried what he called an unusual tone of reservation. Kramer never wrote back. He couldn't, because the truth was worse than reservation. Kramer was starting to believe that by making the Sumerians comprehensible to a modern audience, he had made them false. He had the grammar right. The syntax was sound. But the meaning, the actual meaning, was slipping through his fingers like dry sand. And if the world's foremost expert had gotten the definitions wrong, then every career built on those definitions was a house of cards. If hidden history like this is your thing, subscribe now, because what Kramer revealed next is going to change how you see everything. He kept his mouth shut for years. He watched younger scholars cite his translations, build their reputations, defend their dissertations, all on a foundation he was no longer sure could hold weight. By the time he reached 91, he knew he was out of time. The real story of human origins was going to die in that basement unless he spoke. So he sat in front of a camera and tore down the house he'd spent 6 decades building. But to understand what he said, you first need to understand what he found hiding in the language itself. The language that broke him Now, here's where it gets wild. The Sumerian language did not contain a word for religion. We look at ancient Sumer and we see temples, priests, rituals, offerings. So we call it religion. We put it in the same category as Christianity, or Islam, or Hinduism. But the Sumerians had no such category. The word didn't exist, not because they hadn't invented it yet, but because the entire concept made no sense in their reality. In our world, we draw a hard line between the spiritual and the physical. Churches on one side, laboratories on the other, sacred on this floor, scientific on the next. The Sumerians didn't draw that line at all. They had no concept of a miracle because they had no baseline for what was normal. Everything, the flooding of rivers, the movement of planets, the thoughts inside a human skull, was part of one continuous living power. There was no natural versus supernatural. It was all the same phenomenon expressing itself through different channels.
We know about this today because we have thousands upon thousands of clay tablets from the lost cities of ancient Babylon.
Kramer wrote in a 1983 paper that the Sumerian worldview resists every modern category we attempt to impose upon it. He wasn't being modest. He was sounding an alarm that nobody heard. And this is where it gets really unsettling. When Kramer went back to re-examine how he translated the Sumerian word for God, he realized the actual meaning was nothing like what ended up in the textbooks. It didn't describe beings sitting on thrones, handing down commandments. The word describes something closer to a cosmic principle, a force of nature fused with consciousness. Itself, not a king to be obeyed, a state of reality to be experienced. By the mid-1980s, Kramer was telling anyone who would listen that the more he studied these texts, the less certain he became about his own work. He wrote that he was no longer convinced the Sumerians shared our concept of a world at all. Imagine that. 50 years as the planet's top authority on an ancient civilization, only to realize you've been using the wrong definitions for every major concept. But here's the part nobody talks about. It wasn't just the gods. The Sumerians operated on a mathematical system based on the number 60. We use base 10 because we have 10 fingers. Simple, obvious. But 60 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. It is staggeringly more versatile than anything we use today. And here's the thing. We still live inside their system without even realizing it. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These aren't arbitrary numbers. They're Sumerian. We inherited them wholesale and forgot where they came from. Kramer suspected this mathematical framework wasn't a random cultural choice. He thought it reflected how their minds actually processed reality, that they perceived mathematical relationships and geometric harmonies in the natural world that our brains simply cannot access anymore. And the evidence was hard to argue with. The Sumerians achieved astronomical precision that Europe didn't match until the Renaissance, over 3,000 years later. They calculated the length of a lunar month to within 0.4 seconds of the modern value, a measurement we didn't independently verify until we had atomic clocks. They tracked the movements of Venus across an 18-year cycle and predicted its appearances with accuracy that still impresses planetary scientists today. They mapped the zodiac. They divided the circle into 360 degrees, a system we still use. They tracked planetary cycles across centuries with a consistency that suggests not just patience, but a fundamentally different relationship with the data they were recording. The standard explanation? Patient observation over long periods, passed down through oral tradition and refined over generations.
Sumerian literature consists primarily of epics, myths, hymns, laments, and so-called wisdom literature, which consists of proverbs.
Kramer's explanation was far more dangerous. He believed they were perceiving these patterns directly, without instruments, without telescopes, without anything except a mode of consciousness we have completely lost. He spent the last years of his career looking for the key to a door that had been locked for 5,000 years. And when he sat down with one particular tablet for the last time, what he found made him question every word he'd ever published. The Nibru tablet, the basement of the University of Pennsylvania Museum, late afternoon, 1988. Fluorescent lights humming above rows of metal shelving stacked with clay fragments and acid-free boxes. The air smelled like old dust and institutional cleaning solution. That chemical sharpness mixing with something far older, a mineral heaviness, the faint breath of 4,000-year-old earth that never quite left the room, no matter how many times they cleaned it. Somewhere above, the museum was closing for the night. Footsteps echoed faintly through the ceiling. Down here, it was another world entirely. Samuel Noah Kramer, 91 years old, sat at his metal desk with a single tablet positioned under a magnifying lamp. A piece of baked clay from the ancient city of Nippur, radiocarbon dated to approximately 2100 BCE, one of the most important archaeological sites in all of Mesopotamia. He had first translated this exact tablet in 1949, nearly 40 years earlier. Back then, his reading was clean and straightforward, a dialogue between a human and a god about the origins of civilization. The divine beings gave humanity the gift of knowledge, and civilization began. It confirmed the standard model perfectly, case closed. But that tablet had haunted him for 4 decades, like a splinter lodged too deep to reach. Something about the translation never quite settled. There was a tension in the original Sumerian that his English rendering couldn't capture, a resonance between certain signs that suggested connections his 1949 reading had ignored. Now, in 1988, he sat down to look at it one final time. His assistant, standing near the doorway, later described what happened. Kramer placed both hands flat on the desk, closed his eyes, and seemed to deliberately empty his mind. Then he opened his eyes and stared at the cuneiform impressions in the clay. He didn't move for 3 hours. The only sound was his breathing and the low buzz of the fluorescent tubes above. Dust settled on his shaking hands. His assistant grew worried. She thought the old man was having a medical episode. Then Kramer went completely still. His face turned the color of old paper. 3 full minutes of silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. The word he had translated as gift actually meant awakening. The word he had rendered as human actually meant the sleeping one. And the word he'd spent his career translating as God actually meant the fully aware power. Now, here's where it gets wild. The tablet wasn't describing external beings handing technology to primitive people. It was describing the moment when humans suddenly woke up to abilities they already possessed inside themselves. The knowledge of irrigation, metallurgy, mathematics, astronomy, all of it was already latent, already there. Civilization didn't begin because something was given to us from the outside. It began because something switched on within us. This wasn't a footnote correction. This was a demolition charge placed under the entire field of ancient studies. If Kramer was right, then every book he had ever written contained a foundational error. Every doctoral dissertation his students had completed was built on sand. Every display in every museum from Philadelphia to London to Baghdad was telling visitors a story that fundamentally misrepresented what those ancient people were actually saying. He showed his revised notes to Thorkild Jacobsen at Yale. Jacobsen, the man who had once called Kramer's work the bedrock of the field, reportedly went white. His response, according to a colleague present at the meeting, was blunt. "Samuel, if you publish this, it doesn't just end your legacy. It ends mine. It ends all of ours." Jacobsen wasn't angry, he was terrified. Because he could see the logic. He could see that Kramer might be right. Ax Sjoberg, who had succeeded Kramer as curator of the tablet collection at Penn, reportedly refused to even discuss the new translation. He told Kramer the rereading was an artifact of exhaustion, not insight. But Sjoberg never offered a counter-translation. He never sat down with the tablet himself. He simply wanted the conversation to stop. But here's the catch. Kramer wasn't confused. He had stared at those marks longer than any human being in 5 millennia, and he was certain. He had spent his career dressing the Sumerians in 20th century clothes because it was the only way a modern mind could process them. The tablet was a map to a lost state of consciousness, and he'd spent 40 years reading it like a grocery list. And here's the part that makes it even more disturbing. This awakening appeared to happen almost overnight in the archaeological record. Around 4,500 BCE, in the marshy river plains of southern Mesopotamia, irrigation systems, urban planning, metallurgy, written language, complex mathematics, and organized governance all exploded into existence within what appears to be a single compressed historical window. Scholars call it the Uruk expansion. The conventional explanation is that these innovations developed gradually, And we simply don't have the transitional evidence. Kramer's new reading offered a radically different answer. A sudden, massive shift in human awareness made all of these innovations immediately obvious, like a species that had been sleepwalking for millennia suddenly opening its eyes, like a light switch being flipped on for the entire human race. But every light that can be switched on can also be switched off, and what Kramer found in the tablets from Sumer's final centuries is the most terrifying part of this entire story: the collapse. Most historians explain the fall of Sumer through ordinary causes: military conquest by invading Amorites and Elamites, soil salinity from centuries of irrigation destroying the farmland, environmental collapse, resource depletion, the usual documentary fare, the kind of explanation that fits neatly into a PowerPoint and doesn't make anyone uncomfortable. Kramer saw something different, something buried in the tablets themselves that no one else was willing to talk about. And this is where it gets really unsettling. The writing from Sumer's final centuries didn't just decline in quantity, it declined in kind. The later texts were more concrete, more transactional. Property disputes, grain inventories, boundary markers, administrative records about who owed what to whom. The grand cosmic inquiries that defined the earlier tablets were vanishing, not gradually, like a sunset, more like a signal losing reception, static replacing clarity. The civilization was losing its mind long before it lost its territory. Kramer believed the extraordinary mode of consciousness that made Sumer possible was dissolving. Generation by generation, the people were becoming more like us, more practical, more limited, more efficient at small tasks, and more blind to the enormous patterns their ancestors navigated with ease. He described it in his notes as a narrowing of the bandwidth of human perception. By the end, the Sumerians were staring at the same tablets we stare at today, and feeling the exact same confusion. They could. Read the words their grandfathers had written. The symbols hadn't changed, the clay hadn't crumbled, but something inside the people reading them had shifted so profoundly that the meaning had become alien to their own descendants. An entire civilization watching its own inheritance become unreadable. Not because the language died, because the minds that could comprehend it did. But here's the part nobody talks about. Kramer pointed to the Sumerian king list as his most provocative piece of evidence. This document, preserved across multiple copies and studied by scholars for over a century, records the reigns of rulers stretching back to what the Sumerians considered the beginning of kingship itself. The earliest entries are staggering. Individual kings reigning for 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. 8 kings before the Great Flood, ruling for a combined total of 241,200 years. Standard history waves these away as mythology. Exaggeration. Primitive number crunching by people who couldn't keep real records. Every mainstream Sumerologist, Jacobson included, treated these numbers as symbolic or legendary. Kramer had a different theory, and it hit like a truck. What if those numbers were accurate, just not in the way we assume? What if the earliest Sumerians, the fully awakened ones, experienced time differently? What if a single year in their state of consciousness felt the way a century feels to us? Dense, saturated, overflowing with perceived detail and meaning? As that awareness collapsed, generation by generation, the recorded lifespans shrank. Not because the scribes got better at math, because the people themselves were shrinking. Their experience of time was compressing as their consciousness narrowed. The numbers weren't wrong. Our ability to understand what they measured is what changed. And get this, Kramer's conclusion was the most devastating part of the entire confession. We are not the peak of human evolution. We are what's left. After the collapse, we are the descendants of a catastrophic cognitive event that stripped away our greatest capabilities and left us with just enough awareness to survive, but not enough to understand what we lost. We look at a ziggurat and see an impressive pile of bricks. The people who built it may have seen a machine for the mind, a structure designed to amplify the very state of awareness that was slipping away from them. We look at cuneiform and see a primitive writing system. They may have seen a technology for encoding states of consciousness that can't be expressed any other way. We're standing on the far side of a great divide, trying to read a map while being functionally blind to the territory it describes. In his final recorded interview, Kramer leaned into the camera. His eyes were wet. His voice was barely holding together, and he said something the academic world has spent over 30 years trying to forget. Sumer did not fall because of war. Sumer did not fall because of famine. Sumer fell because the people changed. They lost something inside themselves, and once it was gone, no army in the world could protect what remained. The establishment buried this. They had to, because the implication is almost too uncomfortable to sit with. We have smartphones, we have satellites, we have artificial intelligence and gene editing and rovers on Mars. We have mapped the human genome and split the atom. We tell ourselves we are the pinnacle, the most advanced, most intelligent humans who have ever drawn breath on this planet. But the one man who actually listened to the oldest voices on Earth, who spent 60 years with his ear pressed to clay that was ancient when Alexander the Great was born, spent his final breath telling us we're wrong, that we've lost something so fundamental we don't even have a word for it anymore. That history isn't a record of progress. It's a record of forgetting. Not a climb upward, but a long, slow fall from a height. We can no longer remember reaching. Every breakthrough we celebrate might just be us stumbling back toward a fraction of what was once effortlessly known. Every discovery announced with fanfare might be a faint echo of something our ancestors experienced as casually as breathing. Every Nobel Prize might be a participation trophy for rediscovering crumbs from a table we forgot existed. The tablets are still there. Tens of thousands of them, sitting in museum basements from Philadelphia to Baghdad to London. The clay is intact. The words haven't changed in 4,000 years. But we have changed. And until we understand how deeply, we'll keep reading those tablets and missing the entire point. Just like the last generation of Sumerians did before the lights went out for good. So, here's the question that won't let you sleep tonight. Was the greatest Sumerian scholar in history right? Have we lost an ancient capacity that our ancestors once had? Something so deep and so fundamental that we can't even name it, let alone measure it? Or was a 91-year-old man simply unraveling at the end of a long life spent too close to the silence of the dead? There's no middle ground here. One of those answers changes everything. Drop yours in the comments. Because the people who study this stuff are split right down the middle, and after 30 years, no one has settled it yet. And if this is the kind of hidden history that sets your brain on fire, hit like and subscribe right now, because we've got a video coming next that goes even deeper into what those tablets describe, into the specific instructions the Sumerians left behind for anyone who might one day wake up again. And trust me, this story is far from over.